History has its share of horrors, but few are as grotesque or as absurd as the Zong Massacre of 1781. Imagine this: a British slave ship packed with more than 400 enslaved Africans, shackled and starving in the dark belly of the vessel. The voyage should have been one of survival, but greed turned it into a crime that mocked the very idea of humanity. When disease spread and supplies ran low, the ship's crew did not tighten their belts. They did not cut their rations. They did not steer for shore. Instead, they chose numbers over names, profit over life. One by one, more than 130 enslaved men, women, and children were thrown into the Atlantic Ocean, not because they were dying, but because dead cargo was easier to claim on the ship's insurance policy. Murder written off as a business expense. And the most chilling part? When the ship docked, no one was put on trial for mass murder. The debate that reached Britain's courts was not about lives lost, but about whether the insurance company should pay for the loss of property. Black lives, reduced to balance sheets, drowned twice, once in the waves and once in the law. The Zong Massacre was not an accident, it was a decision. A grotesque calculation where human beings became numbers and numbers became profit. This is the story of how the Atlantic Ocean became a graveyard for greed, and how one court case revealed the true price the world had placed on black lives. Chapter 1: The Floating Prison. The Zong was never meant to be remembered. To its owners, it was just another ship, another floating investment in Britain's vast machinery of empire. But to the hundreds of men, women, and children crammed beneath its deck in 1781, it was something else entirely: a coffin with sails. Picture the hold. The air thick with sweat and sickness, every inch of space filled with chained bodies. You could not stand upright. You could barely breathe. The floorboards dripped with seawater and waste, and the cries of the living blended with the silence of the dead. Each person had been reduced to an entry in a ledger: cargo, stock, units. Their names, their families, their entire histories had been stripped away the moment they were forced aboard. The ship itself groaned like it knew its purpose was obscene. Its timbers creaked, the ropes strained, and yet above deck, the crew treated this misery as routine. To them, this was not a floating hell, it was a floating bank vault. The more bodies that survived the voyage, the more money the investors in London would collect. And if some didn't survive, well, that was simply the cost of doing business. Insurance policies would cover the loss. It is hard to comprehend today, but in 1781, this was ordinary. Britain's ports bustled with vessels like the Zong. Liverpool, Bristol, London, they were built on human cargo. Ships carried sugar, tobacco, cotton, and rum, but always hidden behind the commerce were chains and bodies. The Zong was not exceptional in its design. It was exceptional only in how far its cruelty would go. And so the voyage began. The Zong, heavy with more than 400 enslaved Africans, left the coast of West Africa and pointed its bow toward Jamaica. The ocean stretched endlessly ahead, but the people trapped inside the ship did not dream of horizons. For them, the sea was not freedom. It was silence. It was exile. It was the wall between who they had been and what the empire demanded they become. The irony was brutal. Rome once had its arenas, medieval kings had their dungeons, but Britain had perfected its prison on the waves. A prison that moved, that swallowed lives by the hundreds, and that paid dividends at the end of the journey. This was no ship. This was the Zong, a floating prison, a floating grave, and soon a floating courtroom. Chapter 2: The Voyage of 1781. The Zong left the African coast with more than 400 human beings crammed into its hold, far beyond the number the ship was designed to carry. The crew, greedy and careless, had overloaded the vessel, believing that more cargo meant more profit. It was not just greed, it was mathematics. Every person was a line of revenue, every chained wrist, a coin in the pockets of men who never once touched the ocean. From the moment the ship lurched away from shore, suffering was the constant companion. The air below deck was foul, choking, impossible to breathe without coughing. Dysentery and fever swept through the hold like fire. The cries of children merged with the hacking coughs of the dying. Some whispered prayers in tongues the crew mocked as gibberish. Others simply lay still, waiting for the waves to take them. Above deck, The crew complained not of the screams, but of the smell. They gagged as they went below to check the cargo, covering their noses with cloth, pretending to be disgusted by disease when it was their own cruelty fermenting in the dark. The captain, Luke Collingwood, had sailed before on ships like this. He knew the arithmetic of misery. And yet, even he would make choices so catastrophic that history would recoil in disbelief. The voyage itself was poorly managed. Collingwood was inexperienced as a commander, prone to mistakes, careless with navigation. Freshwater ran dangerously low because of miscalculations. Food supplies dwindled because the crew had stocked poorly. Instead of discipline and order, the ship fumbled forward like a drunk stumbling across the deck, while below, hundreds of lives depended on his every blunder. Weeks passed. The ocean became both cage and coffin. Those who fell ill were left chained, their bodies infecting those beside them. The strong wasted away, the weak disappeared. Some attempted resistance, refusing food, trying to starve themselves rather than continue in captivity. The crew responded with force-feeding, prying mouths open with tools, pouring liquid down throats that had not consented. Survival itself became another form of punishment. To the investors in London, the Zong was just a line of trade. To the people on board, it was hell drifting west. The ocean waves, once sacred in African stories of gods and ancestors, now mocked them with every crash against the hull. For those trapped, the sea was not nature. It was empire's accomplice, carrying them further from home, further from freedom. And yet, the voyage had only begun. The sickness would spread, the rations would rot, the mistakes of Captain Collingwood would pile up, and the crew would see profit slipping through their hands. And in a world where profit was everything, there was only one solution left for them to consider, a solution that would stain history with horror. The Zong sailed on, its sails full of wind, its decks full of cruelty, its hold full of suffering. Somewhere ahead lay Jamaica, but the ship was already sinking, not into the sea, but into infamy. Chapter 3. The Decision to Kill. By late November 1781, the Zong drifted in the mid-Atlantic, its crew weary, its passengers enslaved Africans, starving, suffocating, and dying by the dozens. What should have been a voyage of weeks had stretched into months, prolonged by Captain Collingwood's poor navigation. Jamaica was near, but the ship wandered aimlessly, misjudging distances, chasing phantom coastlines. The mistake would cost more than time. It would cost lives. The barrels of fresh water, already poorly rationed, ran dangerously low. The crew panicked. Without water, they feared they themselves would perish before reaching port. And so, in the warped logic of empire, a meeting was called on deck. Officers gathered, not to pray for rain or to repent their greed, but to calculate. The enslaved people below deck were not considered human beings. They were cargo, investments, property. And if that property died naturally, from thirst, disease, or starvation, the loss would be borne by the ship's owners. But if the cargo was destroyed deliberately, cast overboard into the sea, the insurance policy would cover it. Dead from disease, a loss, dead by drowning, compensation. It was law twisted into ledger, cruelty rationalized into mathematics. The captain and crew agreed. The sickest and weakest among the enslaved would be disposed of to save water for the rest, not out of mercy, but profit. Their crime was not illness, but the danger of reducing financial return. This decision, wrapped in bureaucratic logic, was nothing less than mass murder plotted in cold blood. The enslaved did not know this meeting had taken place, but they would soon feel its verdict. The crew prepared, ropes in hand, not for storm or anchor, but for execution. The Atlantic, vast and indifferent, waited to swallow bodies. In that moment, the Zong ceased to be a ship. It became a courtroom where greed sat as judge, cruelty as jury, and profit as executioner. And the verdict was death. The order was given. The massacre was about to begin. Chapter 4. The Massacre at Sea. The day was deceptively calm. The Atlantic stretched wide and blue, the sun glinting off its surface as though mocking the horror about to unfold. On the deck of the Zong, the crew gathered the first group of captives, mostly women and children weakened by thirst, fever, and exhaustion. Shackles clinked as they were dragged upward into the blinding light. They did not know why. Some thought freedom was near. Others believed they were being brought up for inspection. But as the crewmen tied ropes around their bodies, confusion gave way to terror. One sailor shouted an order, another heaved, and then screams. The bodies of the enslaved were hurled overboard, splashing into the sea, swallowed by the waves. Mothers clutched children as they fell, their cries cut short by water. The ocean foamed red and silent again. Day after day, the slaughter continued. Groups of 10, 20, 30 were cast into the depths. Some resisted, clinging to the rails with desperate strength. They were beaten until their fingers broke, then thrown like refuse into the tide. Others jumped willingly, choosing the sea over the cruelty above deck. Witnesses said the ocean seemed to wail, waves crashing harder with each body it consumed. By the end, more than 130 Africans had been murdered, not by chance, not by storm, but by design. Each splash into the sea was counted not as a life lost, but as a claim filed. The captain and crew kept their records carefully, like accountants balancing their books. Human beings had become numbers, numbers had become currency, and currency had drowned in salt water. The massacre left the ship eerily quiet. The hold, once filled with breath and groans, was hollow. The crew washed the deck, scrubbing blood and salt, as though the sea could erase what had happened. But history would not forget, nor forgive. Name Chapter 5. The Survivors and Their Haunting Silence. Those who remained alive after the massacre did not rejoice. Survival was no triumph, it was a sentence. The hold of the Zong felt heavier, though its numbers were fewer. The screams of those thrown overboard seemed to echo in the planks, in the creak of the ship, in the salt air itself. The survivors huddled in the dark, pressed together by chains that felt tighter than ever. Children cried until their throats gave out, then lay silent in their mother's arms. Men stared blankly ahead, their eyes hollow, their spirits fractured. Every splash of the sea against the hull reminded them of what had happened, of who was missing. Some whispered prayers in languages the crew did not understand. Others sang softly, songs of home and resistance, voices trembling but unbroken. In the darkness of the hold, they tried to keep memory alive, the names of mothers, the faces of fathers, the rhythms of villages torn away. But grief weighed heavier than iron shackles. Above deck, the crew behaved as though nothing had happened. They ate, drank, and quarreled about navigation. The massacre was reduced to numbers in a ledger, a calculation of loss and profit. To them, the captives below were no more than cargo, those dead, no more than discarded merchandise. Yet the silence of the survivors was louder than any scream. It was the silence of lives stripped of voice, of dignity stolen, of trauma so deep that words could not contain it. That silence would travel farther than the ship itself, across centuries, haunting every retelling. The survivors lived, but in their silence lay the shadow of all who had been lost. Chapter 6. The Arrival in Jamaica and the Accounting of Death. When the Zong finally reached Jamaica in December 1781, it was not the stench of the dead that shocked the merchants on shore. Death was expected on slave voyages. What unsettled them was the scale of it. More than 130 lives had been thrown into the sea. But instead of shame or remorse, the ship's owners saw an opportunity. The massacre was reframed not as a crime, but as a financial inconvenience. The captains and investors claimed the deaths were a necessary measure to save the ship, that if the enslaved had not been jettisoned, all would have perished for lack of water. And so with a straight face, they filed an insurance claim. Human beings were reduced to entries on a balance sheet. Each drowned captive was listed as lost cargo, no different than barrels of sugar spoiled in a storm. The ship owners demanded compensation from their insurers, the market value of every man, woman, and child who had been cast into the sea. It was a grotesque inversion of justice. The enslaved, who had suffered unimaginable terror, were absent from the conversation. Their voices, their cries, their resistance, none of it mattered in the colonial courtroom. What mattered were numbers, contracts, and profits. The survivors were sold in Jamaican markets, their suffering erased in the bustle of commerce. The massacre itself might have disappeared into silence had it not been for one thing. The insurers refused to pay. They accused the ship's owners of fraud. not because lives had been taken, but because they suspected the killings were unnecessary, a ruthless ploy for money. Thus began the trial of the Zong Massacre, not as a case of murder, but as a dispute over property. Chapter 7. The Courtroom. Murder on trial as insurance fraud. When the case of the Zong reached London's courts in 1783, it was not framed as a question of morality. No prosecutor rose to accuse Captain Collingwood of mass murder. No jury was asked to weigh the cries of mothers watching their children thrown into the sea. Instead, the trial was presented as a dry matter of insurance law. The shipowners argued that the massacre was a necessary sacrifice under maritime principles. Just as a captain might jettison cargo to save a ship in distress, so too could enslaved Africans be cast into the sea to preserve the rest. They demanded compensation for their lost property. The insurers disagreed. They claimed the killings were not necessity but negligence, or worse, fraud. There had been rain during the voyage, they argued. Water supplies had been replenished. The massacre was not about survival, but about money. The court's debate was surreal. Learned men in powdered wigs parsed words like necessity, loss, and cargo. They did not speak of men, women, and children. They did not ask whether lives had value beyond coin. The very language of the courtroom erased humanity, turning the Atlantic into an accounting ledger. At first, the court sided with the shipowners, agreeing that the loss of cargo should be compensated. It was only upon appeal that the insurers pushed harder, insisting that fraud had been committed. The judges deliberated not on whether killing 130 people was murder, but on whether it was economically justified. The Zong trial revealed the chilling truth of slavery's legal framework. Human life was irrelevant. What mattered was property, profit, and precedent. Yet amidst this grotesque theater of law, whispers began to circulate. People outside the courtroom were horrified. News of the massacre spread, and soon the Zong would become a rallying cry for abolitionists. Chapter 8. The Public Outcry. Granville Sharp and the birth of an abolitionist symbol. When word of the Zong Massacre reached Britain, it was not through the court transcripts alone. It was carried by whispers, pamphlets, and the outrage of those who still believed law and humanity should not be strangers. At the center of this storm stood Granville Sharp, one of the earliest and fiercest abolitionists. Sharp was no stranger to the fight. He had previously challenged slavery in English courts, arguing that no man could be enslaved on British soil. When he heard of the Zong, he was horrified, not just by the killings, but by the fact that no murder charges had been filed. To Sharp, it was proof that the legal system valued profits over lives. He began a relentless campaign to expose the massacre to the public. Letters were written, pamphlets distributed, meetings called. Sharp forced polite London society to confront a question it preferred to ignore. How can a nation that prides itself on liberty tolerate the mass drowning of innocents for insurance money? The Zong quickly became more than a legal case. It became a symbol, a grotesque illustration of slavery's true nature. Abolitionists seized on the story, repeating it in speeches, newspapers, and petitions. The sheer horror of the massacre pierced through the fog of indifference, giving the abolitionist movement one of its first rallying cries. And yet, even with this outcry, justice was elusive. No captain was punished, no owner was jailed. The case remained one of insurance, not murder. But the tide had begun to turn. The Zong became a name spoken with disgust, a stain on Britain's conscience. It would not be forgotten, and its memory would help ignite the fires of abolition. Chapter 9. Olaudah Equiano, the survivor's voice that shook the empire. If Granville Sharp gave the Zong its legal spotlight, it was Olaudah Equiano who gave it a human voice. A formerly enslaved African who purchased his freedom and became one of the most powerful abolitionist writers of the 18th century, Equiano carried the memory of the Middle Passage in his very flesh. Equiano had not been aboard the Zong, but he understood its horrors with painful clarity. He had once endured the stench of bodies crammed below deck, the choking heat, the chains that cut into wrists and ankles. He knew how close any voyage could come to death, not by disease alone, but by the cold arithmetic of profit. When the news of the Zong reached him, Equiano worked tirelessly to spread the story. He collaborated with sharp, lobbied politicians and ensured the massacre was not buried under legal jargon. His voice carried the authenticity of survival. He had lived what the drowned had suffered. To polite society, he became a living witness, someone who could look them in the eye and declare, "This is not distant tragedy. This is the truth of slavery itself." Equiano's published autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, 1789, intertwined his personal story with the broader horrors of the trade. In it, the Zong was invoked as the embodiment of slavery's cruelty. Human beings discarded like spoiled cargo, lives reduced to numbers on a ledger. Through Equiano, the massacre was not just a statistic. It became a story of people who might have sung songs, told stories, loved families, until the sea swallowed them. His words spread across Britain and beyond, inspiring abolitionist circles and shaking the foundations of complacency. The Zong was no longer just a legal case. Through Equiano's pen, it became a rallying cry heard across the Atlantic world. Chapter 10. The Zong in Art and Memory. From Turner's paintings to abolitionist propaganda. The Zong Massacre might have been buried in dusty court records if not for the artists and activists who turned atrocity into memory. Law could disguise cruelty in the language of insurance and property, but art had the power to strip away euphemism and confront society with its own reflection. One of the most famous responses came decades later from J.M.W. Turner, the great Romantic painter. In 1840, as Britain celebrated the abolition of slavery in its empire, Turner unveiled The Slave Ship, a furious, haunting vision of human bodies sinking beneath stormy waters, their shackled limbs barely visible among thrashing waves and circling fish. Though not explicitly labeled as the Zong, the painting was unmistakably inspired by its horrors. Turner forced his audience to look into the sea and see not nature's beauty, but man's cruelty. But long before Turner, abolitionist campaigners had already seized on the Zong as a rallying symbol. Pamphlets, sermons, and political tracts told the story with deliberate shock. The massacre became abolition's proof. Here was slavery's essence, not labor, not economics, but murder. The Zong story spread across the Atlantic. In America, abolitionists cited it in their campaigns, pointing out that slavery's logic knew no borders. In Britain, poets and pamphleteers described the waters of the Caribbean as stained forever with blood. It was not only a legal or political argument, it was moral theater aimed at stirring outrage. And in this, the Zong became more than an event. It became a symbol of profit's triumph over life, of law's complicity in injustice, and of art's ability to preserve memory when courts tried to erase it. Chapter 11. The Long Aftermath. Reparations denied and legacies ignored. The Zong Massacre did not vanish when the last wave swallowed the last chained body. It lingered in courtrooms, in political debates, in whispered histories passed down through generations, and yet justice never truly arrived. The courts had reduced the case to a matter of money, never of murder. The insurance was contested, but no captain, no crewman, no owner of the Zong ever stood trial for the killing of more than 100 Africans. The verdict was silence. The law had spoken, property lost, not lives stolen. Even after Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in 1833, the echoes of the Zong remained. The enslaved and their descendants received no reparations. Instead, it was the slave owners who were compensated for their losses. The British government borrowed the equivalent of billions today to pay them off, a debt so large it was not fully repaid until 2015. The descendants of the enslaved inherited only the memory of trauma, while the descendants of enslavers inherited wealth. The Zong thus became a symbol not only of the horrors of slavery, but of the long shadow of injustice. Its lesson was clear: freedom without reparations is not justice, it is survival. Memory without accountability is not healing, it is an open wound. And yet, the story continues to be told. In paintings, in poems, in classrooms, and in the voices of activists who still demand recognition, the Zong lives on. Its waters have not gone silent. They ask a question that the present still struggles to answer. What does it mean to value human life above profit? Closing reflection, the Zong was more than a ship. It was a floating ledger, a courtroom farce, and a graveyard without markers. Its legacy is not confined to 1781. It is etched into modern economies, politics, and inequalities that still shape our world. To remember the Zong is to remember the cost of forgetting. It is to refuse the comfort of silence. It is to say, the ocean does not keep secrets, and neither should we.